welcome to the series of interviews I'm doing with key policymakers and influencers in the critical Australia-India relationship, one of the most important strategic and people-to-people relationships in the Indo-Pacific. Today we have with us someone really special, Chef Gary Mehigan, a world-renowned chef, restaurateur, television personality who has made a huge impact on the culinary world. He was introduced to India, at least to me, as a judge on the iconic television show MasterChef Australia, and since then has been traveling extensively to India and has been exploring the cuisines, cultures, and traditions of regions across the country. He is by far one of the most recognizable faces bridging India and Australia through his love for food. Gary, thank you so much for joining me today. It really is a pleasure having you as a part of this series we are doing on India-Australia relations.
Thank you. What an intro. I couldn't have said it better myself. Now you put me under pressure to test my memory from all those visits.
I'm sure you'll do just fine. We've seen enough of your interviews. Let me begin by asking you, Gary. You've traveled to India so much. You've spent time in places which are personal favorites of mine, like Nagaland. But before we discuss that, let me ask you, what inspired you to start exploring Indian cuisine and, of course, culture that goes with the cuisine?
Well, I think really the main impetus was, I think, back in, I think it was 2010. It was at quite a crucial time, to be honest, around that period for Australian business, particularly, and kind of our, shared relationship. There'd been a few issues in Melbourne, some odd incidences that had kind of drawn the Indian press to students here in Victoria, particularly. And, as always, press had, had made a big deal out of what was happening. And so I think food and the conversation around food and our shared kind of love really captured people's interest. And certainly from whether it was winemakers or importers of land, they're like, oh, you're hot property. So that was our first introduction. So it was a really gentle kind of introduction to, well, I say gentle. I mean, I call it beautiful chaos. I mean, I'd never been anywhere like it. I think we touched down in Mumbai and then were whisked off to Delhi after a few days. And I was just like, what the hell is going on? But it was kind of the start of this fascination with, a very different culture, 5,000-year-old history, a very young country, and just kind of digging my fingers into a cuisine that I'd only really touched on as a chef. And I still really, after another, 10 or 12 years, really don't feel I have it in my fingers like somebody who's born and grown up there.
That's an inquisitive mind. When you've been for so many years, you still don't know, the cuisine. We'd obviously, disagree on that. But, I also noticed that on MasterChef Australia, we used to have a lot of street food creations. And, MasterChef had taken the opportunity to sort of, make this available to, its wide viewership. You went beyond fine dining. Do you think, now that you've traveled to India so much, you've made the effort to get to know street food in India? Do you think there is any sort of, opportunities of incorporating street food flavors and techniques into fine dining or culinary context?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. I think, look, the culinary world is always searching for something new and different, and the inspirations are global these days. I mean, Instagram, social media has changed the face of food immeasurably. And what I mean by that is that the transfer of information is fairly instantaneous. A restaurant, like Noma can be, posting what it put out for dinner last night, and someone in Chicago, Melbourne or Delhi is picking up on an idea, an inspiration, a flavor. And so that transfer of ideas, I think, along with the advent and the popularity of MasterChef bringing down the curtain on professional kitchens has really made a difference. And so I think the culinary world is kind of hungry for, I know it sounds, what a cliche, is hungry for anything new. And so, I think perfect timing in terms of the Indian community here in Australia, very multicultural. We've got big Vietnamese community, Greek, Italian, Indian. We've now got smaller communities making an impact, whether that's, Sudanese or, Laotian. So it was perfect timing, I think, certainly for some of our Indian contestants to appear on television and do things that people hadn't seen. You know, Indian restaurants here, a lot of takeaway restaurants all doing the same thing. And now all of a sudden you might have a contestant from Kerala, or like you say, a contestant from somewhere far flung like the Northeast. And all of a sudden people are watching food or seeing food prepared that they'd never experienced before. So that's exciting. And that's what I found on every visit. Every time I go, I'm discovering something new. And based on my kind of classic, you know, French, European, you know, mainly French, European training, techniques aren't often easily acquired, you know, and the length and breadth of, or, you know, the depth of Indian cuisine is phenomenal. I mean, we're not telling anything new to anybody, I suppose, but there's still a lot of people that don't realize how different the people are, the languages are, the food, the tradition, the cultures are in India and from different parts of India.
Yeah, I know, like we say, you know, every couple of 100 kilometers, the food changes, the language changes.
Yeah. Household to household, you know,
Household to
area to
household,
area,
yeah.
region to region. And, you know, like I say, you know, I was up in Nagaland and I'm so excited at having come back and telling all my friends and family and colleagues what I'd seen. And they're like, what? You know, I said, yeah, there's no, you know, like we're right on the Myanmar-China border. They're leaning into Asia, you know, more than they are India, but they're uniquely Indian. It's 17 principal tribes and, you know, describing the clothes and the ceremonies and things around, you know, the Hornbill Festival, which to me was just such a beautiful kind of expression of that, the pride of that area. And then trying to explain to people, you know, what people are walking out of the markets with, you know, what they're eating on a daily basis, the fact there's no spices like, you know, we all expect Indian food to have, you know, turmeric and coriander and cumin. They're all aromatics, a lot of ginger, wild ginger, you know, and yeah, it's, people are like, really? I go, yeah, you got to go. Or someone's got to be cooking it so we can eat it.
You know, but having said that, Naga food in the last, like I told you before, I've been going there for many years, and when I started traveling there, not many people knew about it in India, let alone
Yeah.
elsewhere, you know. But in the
Yeah.
last like 5, 6, 7 years, you've started seeing Naga restaurants open up across the country, which is great, you know. And I know that you traveled festival to festival. You've been to a lot of festivals. You've done the Onam, and you know you've been to
Yeah.
Calcutta.
We did Hornbill, we did Durga Puja.
Hornbill,
I'm back over
correct?
at the end of the month for Holi, so that's going to be interesting.
Oh, that's fantastic. So Hornbill, let me ask you about Hornbill. You know, let me ask you about Naga food. Like, what was your experience like in terms of, you know, they use some spectacular chilies as well. You know,
Yeah.
which is quite crucial in some of their dishes. So, you know, what sort of a palate do you think that sort of appeals to? Does it appeal to an Australian palate?
Yeah, of course it does. I think, you know, the challenge, you know, for most people are unfamiliar ingredients and textures, particularly. I always describe, for example, in an Australian and Indian context, we tend to like kind of crunchy
Mm.
combinations of crunchy, gooey, smooth, warm, cold. I mean, like think of panipuri. It's kind of all those things put together. But Australian palates are much the same. That's why we love crisps, or we love, you know, Thai food that's crunchy and fresh and things like this. Whereas often in, say, Chinese cuisine, there's chewy and squeaky and slippery, all textures that we're not used to. So the main challenge normally in kind of globalizing or making a palette of flavors or dishes available to the, you know, broader public is things like that. Unfamiliarity, strong flavors. They can be fermented or sour or ammonia, you know, like all these different things that some people find utterly delicious and others find quite challenging or horrible, quite frankly. You know, it's like the Japanese really can't understand blue cheese, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we would none, you know, for example, in Nagaland, the concept of insects, eating insects, is quite normal. And
Yeah.
you know, in global terms, this is future food. You know, people are trying to introduce the idea of consuming insects as to do as protein, and they can be mealyworms and or you know any type of kind of I suppose, disguised. I mean, even my dogs have a insect biscuit made out of mealyworm because it's low allergenic. And actually, I hate to tell anybody, but they smell quite toasty and interesting. I wouldn't eat one, but I'm just saying that's why the dogs like them. But it's that was even a challenge for me, and I've got to put my kind of chef's brain into action and go, look, this is delicious. People love it. What do they love about it? Is it the texture? Is it how something feels, in your mouth? Is it crunchy first? Is it gooey later? Is it, is there something that obviously is delicious and I need to tune into it? And I ate, hornet larvae. I ate crispy hornets. I ate silkworm, redworm, carpenter worm. So I really kind of dug in, and all of those things were just delicious. It was just getting your head around the fact that it's not what you eat normally. So yeah, there's some of the challenges, but then obviously you've got things like the Naga pork, which is smoked over the hearth, or the hearth, lots of smoked salted fish, things that are kind of inherently foraged, whether they're Naga fern or the famous Naga chili, which is really hot. And so, a first trip to the market kind of reveals all those ingredients. Some different, some very familiar. And then going into people's houses and seeing how they're cooked or how they celebrate, that's a unique experience for me. When somebody puts in effort, when they cook for you and give it to you, you're not going to turn your nose up.
No.
It's beautiful. So yeah, I got fed very well. And some things like the insects really, I ate, spiders I ate too. I was very lucky to help judge the annual Naga Chef competition. So had some creative amateurs kind of putting up very proudly Naga food. And I ate in different homes and stayed in a little homestay where, I just got cooked a meal pretty much every night. So I really kind of dug in, and I had a great kind of first experience.
That's really the way to do it, isn't it? In places like this, because, culture is so closely tied to food across
Yeah.
India,
And people, and don't forget when you put it out too, and I did on my Instagram, I go, before you judge, because people are so willing to just judge based on their own life. I said, before you judge, make your decision based on in the context of a Naga life, which is a very different place to where you live in,
right.
Whether it's San Sebastian, in Spain, or Melbourne, or, in Paris, we don't live, and we don't want to live like everybody else. So it's actually, when I posted, it was received quite well, I think, because I made those statements. Before you make a comment about hornets, understand it a little bit, do your research, find out why this foraging is important, why it's an important part of their lives, and why they culturally, this is something that the Naga are very proud of.
Quite right, culture and food, I think not just with the Nagas, but everybody else is so closely tied together.
Sure.
Even I come from Gujarat, and even in Gujarat, it changes area to area and culture to culture changes, and according to that, your food is sort of modified. Did you find this across your travels across
Yeah.
India?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's so complex. I mean, India's history is very complex. It's intertwined. And yet in some cases, whether it's up, northeast, or, in isolated areas and villages down south, there's some things that are, very unique and well protected, and also and not very familiar, as you say, to much of India itself. And I think until I started traveling, until I started getting out of, that kind of, for a while, I was just Mumbai, Delhi, Hyderabad, Chennai, for example, or Bengaluru, till I started getting out of those areas. You come across, a Naga restaurant, you eat Naga food, but it doesn't, it's not the same as driving up the mountain, through the mountains. And do you know what I mean? It's not the same as being there. And it's the same as first trip to Goa, reveals that, Portuguese and, Spanish connection. And, you do a little research and you realize that not only is India kind of into its relationships and regions and peoples are intertwined, but intertwined with the whole world. I mean, that's the spice trade that brought everybody, through India, and how that's, whether it's, the Afghans or the Mughals coming down. I mean, when I see desserts, for example, that have got chopped fruit and nuts, they're deep fried, they're soaked in syrup, and you go, wow, it's Persian, it's Iranian, it's Turkish. And then you see the ruffles, what do you call it? The heckles go up. No, this is uniquely Indian. And you go, explain that. And where did it come from? So I love that. I love those food trails. When people get, their heckles up about, kind of protecting tradition. And I love that. Don't forget, at one time it was new and it was unique and it was never seen before. And that includes, there were no chilies, there were no cauliflowers, potatoes, some staples that India, I suppose they're inseparable from, day-to-day food. Where would Indian food be without potatoes? And yet, they didn't exist before the trade routes opened up and people bought them there. Tomatoes, for example.
Correct. Let me bring you to Australia now. The Australian and Indian cultures have influenced each other over time. People seem to be more familiar about each other's food cultures. Would you agree with that? And have you found any similarities between the Australian and Indian cuisine?
Yeah, sure. I think, like I said before, I think texture, rather than flavor tends to be our great kind of unifier. We love the same, and temperature, like that street food idea. That's why people, when they go to India, Australians, when they go to India, they love the street food, because it's crispy, it's crunchy, it's warm, it's cold, that. And I only use panipuri because it's almost like molecular gastronomy, but it's hundreds of years old. You know what I mean? So I think they're the unifiers. And so this complex use of spices in some areas, very simple, singular use of spices in others, or aromatics, like I say, going northeast. I think what we haven't really understood in Australia is how complex and how different the food is. I think our, most of us, I include me, I don't really include me in it, but most people assume that Indian food is a very narrow band of curry and North Indian primarily, and mostly influenced from, periods of time where those waves of migration happened, and there were reasons for that. We know why. So those waves of migration tend to hang on to and preserve their culture through the food that they had at the time. So actually, and the Greek community is the same, the Italian community is the same in Australia. They hang on to that food, and yet things have changed, around the world. And so, I always used to laugh because they go, George Columbaris used to tell me he'd have Greek, people come into his restaurant and go, "This isn't Greek." And he go, "Well, when was the last time you went to Greece?" And they go, "Oh, 1966. And he goes, "Well, if you go to Athens now, this is what we're eating." So it's almost like they've because they're hanging on to it. It's the one thing that reminds them of home. So it takes a long time for that to change. And I think we've been stuck with, butter chicken and dal makhni and, all these kind of things that really, in a broader Indian context. I mean, if you're in Kerala, no one's eating dal makhni.
No, it represents a very, very small region.
Narrow band. Exactly. And it's quite heavy and rich. And when you go there, so when you're in North India, and you're eating a dal dish that's, got lots of spices in it, you understand why that's like that. Whereas when you're in the south of India, you're in Kerala and you're eating a fish fry, with a masala, or you're eating a fish moile, for example, it makes total sense. Lime and coconut curry leaves, fresh aromatics. So I think this is what we haven't discussed. So we haven't experienced. So when you talk about Indian, Australian food and what we understand, I think it's just starting to go. There's probably a handful of restaurants, like Enter Via Laundry, for example, here in Melbourne, where, a whole new world of Indian food or regional Indian food is just hitting, is taking, Australian palates by storm.
So would you say that the Indian community, the diaspora there, has influenced the food industry in Australia to some measure?
Well, I think I don't think it's been as influential as it has deserved to have been. I think it's just happening now, and I think maybe that's almost a new wave of migration. It's also first generation, second generation young Indian chefs that maybe have learnt French food or Australian food broadly, or in a broad sense. And our food's very eclectic here in Australia. It can be very heavily influenced by Southeast Asia. Lots of fresh, lots of crunchy. But then they might be then dipping their toe back into a family heritage that they'll travel back to India. They dig a little deeper. They realize they didn't really know anything about Indian food, and they're bringing that to life back here in Australia. Not every case, but I'm just saying it's a good example. It's much the same as young Indian chefs that have gone overseas and gone back to India, and then are now doing really beautiful, edgy, interesting versions of dishes, and also rediscovering very local, colloquial ingredients, indigenous ingredients and dishes that most of India wouldn't know. Which is exciting, right? So traditional on one side, great, we love it, it anchors us all. But then this kind of the young minds bringing something different and new.
So, what would you say are the opportunities and the challenges for these young chefs and entrepreneurs in both these countries?
I think it's all opportunity as far as I'm concerned. I think it's a great era of kind of specialization. Once upon a time, restaurants and chefs used to, a chef would train for 10, 15 years before they were even considered to be, vaguely qualified enough to open their own restaurant. And they would learn hundreds of recipes and become experts, across a broad range of techniques. Whereas now you can specialize in one thing. It could be biryani or macaron or, who knows, granola, and you can become an entrepreneur and a businessman, and you can become an expert in that field very quickly and have a lot of influence. Look at what Pooja Dhingra has done in Mumbai, for example. She brought macaron to India, and became very successful because of it. So I think it's a lot of it's opportunity. I think the challenge is always running a restaurant is that you've got to be tough enough and I suppose nimble enough to survive the early years in establishing your reputation. That's a tough one until people start flocking to your restaurant, in theory. And they trust you to feed you. That's the goal.
Absolutely. So, Gary, thank you so much. But finally, I have one last question, which is when are you coming back to India, and what is your destination going to be?
Yes, I'm flying back in on the 26th of this month, so February, so next week actually, to film Holi. So that's going to be interesting. All based around Delhi, obviously, and not traveling too far. And then back again in April for Eid. And then I've got another 4 to 5 visits across the year covering various festivals. Not been all confirmed yet, but we're with Nat Geo India, National Geographic India, we're making a series called Mega Festivals. So this has been a dream come true for me. It allows me, and it's not really a food show. It's a travel show. It's from my perspective. And I said, why on earth don't you have an Indian host, translating these stories? Why me? And they said, because you get excited about everything, and you notice things that we take for granted. And I've absolutely loved the experience. I mean, the first episode we filmed, which was Onam, was just, we covered the Nauru boat race. We were in Aramula. We were the Pulakali dancers, which are the tiger dancers. We were at Trikakara temple to be part of Thura Onam, and serving, not me, but the very good chefs that were there, feeding 25,000 people over 3 days. The pukalam, which is the little, the flower arrangements, and then one of the biggest pukalam in India. So just these experiences for me, and as much about place, it's about people. I just love, people. And if I'm friendly and I'm smiling and I'm interested, I'm excited, then of course they welcome me, with open arms. And, one of the things that I think really, is really something we have in common as Australians and Indians is our shared sense of humor. Like, we just get each other. I don't know if you agree, but we just get each other. I think we're quite self-deprecating. We're willing to laugh at ourselves. And I think we have a healthy kind of resistance to authority that's kind of, it's rooted in from a different place, but it's very familiar. And so it's this, you know, yeah, you think you're important. I love that kind of attitude. So it's the sense of humor and that attitude that I find straight away, you know, everything seems so familiar, and it's the people, it's the warm-heartedness and the generosity of most of the people that I meet. There's always one or two.
I think if you, you know, appeal to an Indian sense of food, they tend to
and
get
food, of course, it's food. Yeah, yeah. I also joke about the fact that I don't think there's any nation on the planet. I always used to think that the Italians, you know, hoisted this trophy above their head, which was who argues about food more. I thought it belonged to the Italians. It's not the Italians. It's the nation that is India. They argue over the smallest thing that I love it. It makes me smile. I just go, yes, of course.
So, you know, in January, we have this festival in Gujarat called Makar Sankranti, which is also the kite flying festival. And every household makes this special dish called undiyu, which is a mixture of vegetables which they cook under the earth. It's become a competition now within families because, you know, whose undiyu is better gets probably higher status in society.
See, and I love this. This is what I love. And it's and I think that's what, you know, as we're smiling and laughing together, isn't it easy? You know, we forget how much food kind of reminds us of what we have in common rather than what divides us. And it's a difficult place to live for many in the world these days. So it is one of those great unifiers, which I love.
Gary, it was incredible to have you on. I think I could have spoken to you for many hours more about, you know, our shared love for food. But really, it's people like you who are taking this entire relationship beyond cricket and curry.
Oh, it's a tough call. The cricket is a tough call. I've been ignoring the news in the last couple of days as well. You know, I think the headline was catastrophic, was what I read, the Australian team today. But anyway, I don't go into that. Food is much more interesting, and the culture is much more interesting. So,
absolutely. So, best of luck for your next trip. And
thank you. Appreciate it.
On and. You know, I'm really glad that you were able to make it to this very special series of interviews that we're doing on the India-Australia relationship and how quickly it's developing, even though it's so far away. You know? So thank you so much, and I really hope to, you know, have you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Speak soon.
Thank you.